I didn't mind being called old, I was 71 after all, but there's a special kind of cruelty in the way some people say it, like age is a stain that spreads onto everything you touch. And that was exactly how my son-in-law, Ryan, looked at me the afternoon he decided my life's work belonged in a dumpster. The day started with the familiar comfort of metal and wood, the smell of oil on my hands, the quiet order of my workshop behind the house, where my tools hung in their places like loyal companions, chisels sharpened to a whisper, hand planes worn smooth by decades, a set of wrenches my late wife, Evelyn, once cleaned for me with a rag and a smile when I came home exhausted. I was tightening a hinge on a cabinet door, one last job for an old friend, when I heard Ryan's shoes on the gravel, fast and impatient, the kind of steps that tell you the person wearing them thinks time belongs to him. "There you are," he said, not greeting me, not asking how my back was doing, not even looking at the cabinet I'd spent the morning perfecting. He stood at the threshold of the workshop like a landlord inspecting a tenant, tall, 36, beard trimmed precisely, eyes always scanning for something to judge, and behind him was my daughter Nadia, holding our grandson on her hip, her face tired in the way that nurses carry tiredness like a second uniform. Ryan flicked his gaze over my benches, my racks, the labeled drawers Evelyn helped me organize years ago, and he made a small noise of disgust, as if the sight offended him. "We need to clear this out," he declared. I set my screwdriver down gently because I've learned that men like Ryan feed on reactions. "Clear what out?" I asked. He gestured broadly like a king dismissing peasants. "All this scrap, it's a fire hazard, it's an eyesore, it's embarrassing." The word embarrassing hit me harder than it should have, not because I cared what he thought, but because my daughter's shoulders tightened as if she'd heard that word many times before, embarrassing. I wiped my hands on a rag. "These aren't scraps," I said. "They're tools." Ryan laughed loud and sharp. "Tools," he echoed. "Harold, these are museum pieces, rusted junk. Nobody uses this stuff anymore. If you want to play carpenter, buy modern equipment, or better yet, just stop. You're not that guy anymore." My grandson squirmed and Nadia shifted him higher, eyes flicking to the ground. "Ryan," she murmured, "please." He didn't even turn to her. "No, I'm serious," he said, voice rising. "We're trying to improve the property. We're hosting my boss next month. We can't have a backyard that looks like a retirement hobby corner." Retirement hobby corner. I looked around my workshop, my sanctuary, my therapy, my identity after Evelyn died, and I could almost see her in the doorway the way she used to stand there, hair tied back, holding lemonade in the summer, telling me to take breaks because my heart wasn't as young as my ambition. Evelyn had known what these tools meant. They weren't hobbies, they were the language my hands spoke when words weren't enough. I kept my voice calm. "This workshop was here before you," I said. Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice in that poisonous, controlled way. "And it shouldn't be here after me." Nadia flinched like he'd slapped the air. I felt something cold settle in my chest, not anger, but clarity. "What exactly are you asking?" I said. "I'm not asking," he replied. "I'm telling. We're renting a dumpster this weekend. Everything you do need goes. We'll keep a hammer and maybe a screwdriver, sure, but the rest, gone, scrap, it's time." Nadia finally spoke louder, desperation leaking through. "Dad made things with those tools. He fixed half the neighborhood." Ryan cut her off with a wave. "Nadia, he can make memories somewhere else. We have a house to run, kids, bills, we need space. And frankly, your dad living here is already a lot." There it was, the real complaint, the real rot underneath the tool talk. Since Evelyn passed, Nadia begged me to move in for company, but the truth revealed itself slowly. Ryan wanted the image of a generous son-in-law without the inconvenience of actually being one. I stared at him, this man who wore success like cologne, and I realized he believed the world was arranged in tiers, and he believed I had fallen to the bottom tier. He had no idea what I still carried. Nadia whispered, eyes shiny, "Maybe we can move some of it just to make things easier." Her voice cracked on easier, and I hated Ryan for putting that tremble there. I took a slow breath. "All right," I said quietly, and Ryan's face brightened like a child who'd won a game. "Good," he said, clapping his hands once. "Finally, see, this is what I mean, practical, practical, like discarding a lifetime." He turned to Nadia. "Tell him to start with the back shelves. We'll do the dump run Saturday." Then he looked at me again and the smirk returned. "And Harold, don't get sentimental, scrap is scrap." He walked away, already tapping his phone, already elsewhere, and Nadia lingered, eyes pleading. "Dad, I'm sorry," she said. "He's under pressure." I almost laughed at that. Pressure. Evelyn used to say pressure doesn't change a person, it reveals them. I reached out and touched my daughter's cheek with the back of my fingers, gentle. "It's all right," I lied, because if I told her the truth, that her husband was slowly turning her home into a place where love had to ask permission, I didn't know what it would break in her. She left, and the workshop fell quiet again, but the quiet wasn't comforting now. It was the kind of silence that follows an insult you pretend didn't hurt. I sat on my stool and looked at my hands, the veins raised like river paths, the knuckles thick from decades of honest labor, and for a moment I let grief roll through me, not only for Evelyn, but for the version of myself who used to be automatically respected because he was strong and useful and young. Age had turned me into something Ryan thought he could rearrange. That evening after dinner, Ryan brought it up again in front of the kids like a performance. "We're finally cleaning that junkyard out back," he announced, spearing a piece of chicken. "It's about time." Nadia's fork paused. The children didn't care, but I saw Nadia's mouth tighten as if she wanted to defend me and didn't know how without triggering his temper. Ryan leaned back, satisfied, and looked at me with a grin that wanted applause. "You'll feel lighter once it's gone," he said. "Trust me." I took a sip of water, steadying myself. "My wife chose those tools," I said softly. Kept them old when my arthritis got bad. She labeled the drawers. Ryan's laugh cut through my sentence like a saw through pine. Your wife is gone, Harold, he said, casual and cruel as if stating weather, and you can't keep living in the past. Nadia's chair scraped back slightly. She caught herself and sat again, eyes wet. Something inside me, something that had been dormant since Evelyn's funeral, lifted its head. Don't speak about her like that, I said quietly. Ryan's smile tightened. Or what? He asked, leaning forward. You'll build me a birdhouse, he chuckled at his own joke. I felt my pulse in my ears, but I kept my face calm because I had learned the worst thing you can do to a man like Ryan is show him you're bleeding. I stood slowly, nodding once as if accepting his nonsense. You're right, I said. It is time. His eyes flashed with victory. Good, he said, finally. I walked away from the table not to retreat, but because I suddenly remembered something Evelyn had told me months before she died, when the chemo made her voice thin and her hands cold, when she asked me to bring her a folder from the safe and said, Harold, if anything happens to me, promise you won't let anyone cheapen what we built. I had promised. I had meant it. And now, hearing Ryan call my life's work scrap, hearing him erase Evelyn with a sentence, I realized the promise wasn't about money, it was about dignity. That night after everyone slept, I went to the small study closet where Nadia kept old paperwork, and behind a stack of children's drawings and tax folders, I found what I was looking for. An envelope with my name in Evelyn's handwriting, sealed, dated, and heavier than paper should feel. My throat tightened. I had seen it before, but I hadn't opened it. Grief made me avoid anything that felt like her last words. But Ryan had pushed me into a place where avoiding was no longer an option. I held the envelope under the desk lamp, tracing her handwriting with my thumb, and I understood with sudden certainty that Saturday's dumpster was not the real battle. The real battle was what Ryan believed he was entitled to take: space, respect, legacy, because he thought an old man had nothing left to defend. I slid the envelope into my pocket, sat in the darkness, and whispered, All right, Evelyn, I'm ready. Because my son-in-law had no idea that the tools he called scrap were tied to something bigger than his ego, and very soon a lawyer would open a will he never knew existed, and call my life's work what it truly was: a fortune. I barely slept that night, not because Ryan's words echoed in my ears, though they did, but because the envelope in my pocket felt heavier than it had any right to, like Evelyn herself was sitting on the edge of the bed waiting for me to finally listen. And when the house grew quiet enough that I could hear the ticking of the hallway clock, I slipped into the bathroom, locked the door, and opened it with hands that trembled more than they ever did holding a saw. Inside was her handwriting, careful and looping despite the tremors the illness gave her, and a second folded document clipped behind it, thicker, official, stamped with a law firm's seal. And as I read her words, Harold, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, but please don't let anyone make you small. I felt my chest tighten so hard I had to brace myself against the sink, because she had known somehow that one day someone would try to strip meaning from the things we built together. And she refused to let that be the end of our story. She wrote about the workshop, about how those tools weren't just tools but proof that a life could be shaped by patience instead of shortcuts. And then she explained the second document, the one she insisted stay hidden until I felt I truly needed it. A trust meticulously organized, holding not just the workshop property but the licensing rights, small patents and contracts we'd accumulated quietly over 40 years, custom joinery designs, specialty fixtures, restoration methods that larger firms had paid to use without ever knowing the faces behind them. I sat on the closed toilet lid, breathing shallow, stunned by the scope of what she'd protected, while I focused on simply surviving after her diagnosis. By the time dawn crept through the frosted window, I understood why she never argued when I downplayed my work, why she smiled softly when people underestimated us. She was playing the long game, safeguarding dignity the way I safeguarded wood grain, slow and deliberate. Morning came with the sound of Ryan's voice barking orders to the kids, the smell of burnt toast, the everyday chaos of a house that had no idea it was sitting on a fault line. At breakfast, Ryan announced the dumpster delivery like a celebration. Saturday, first thing, he said, chewing loudly. We'll knock it out in a few hours. Nadia stared at her plate, shoulders hunched, and I could see the exhaustion etched into her face, exhaustion not from work or motherhood, but from constantly smoothing the edges of a man who treated compromise like defeat. Dad, she said quietly, you don't have to help if it's too much, Ryan snorted. It's just lifting junk, he said. He'll be fine. I met my daughter's eyes and gave her a small nod. I'll be there, I said, and Ryan smiled, satisfied, mistaking my calm for surrender. That day passed slowly. I spent it in the workshop, touching each tool like a farewell, not because I intended to lose them, but because I needed to remember why they mattered before anyone tried to erase them again. I could almost hear Evelyn's voice reminding me not to rush, telling me the wood would tell me when it was ready, and as I worked, I realized Ryan's cruelty had done something unexpected. It had pulled me back into myself, back into the certainty that I wasn't finished yet. Saturday morning arrived with the growl of a diesel engine, and when the dumpster was dropped in the driveway, Ryan clapped his hands like a foreman. All right, let's go, he said. Start with the back shelves like we agreed. Kids watched from the porch, curious, and Nadia hovered near the door, wringing her hands. Ryan grabbed a box and tossed it into the dumpster without looking. I picked up a plane, my first good one, balanced just right, and instead of dropping it, I held it up. Do you know what this is? I asked. Ryan rolled his eyes. A paperweight? No, I said. It's the tool that paid for your honeymoon. He froze. What? I sold a design using this plane to a restoration firm in '92, I said evenly. They paid well, he scoffed. You're exaggerating, I set it aside carefully. No, I said, I'm remembering. He stepped closer, irritation flaring. Harold, don't start spinning stories now. That's when I reached into my jacket and pulled out the folder I'd prepared the night before, copies of contracts, royalty statements, trust summaries, not everything just enough. These aren't stories, I said, handing him the first page. He glanced at it, frowned, then read again, slower. The color began to drain from his face. What is this? He demanded. Documentation, I replied, of the scrap you're throwing away. Nadia stepped forward, eyes widening as she scanned the page. Dad, what is this? It's what your mother protected, I said softly. Ryan's voice rose. This is ridiculous. You're trying to manipulate us because you're emotional. No, I said, I'm trying to stop you from making a very expensive mistake. He laughed sharply. You expect me to believe your rusty tools are worth millions? I met his gaze. I expect you to believe a lawyer will explain it better than I can. That shut him up for half a second. What lawyer? He snapped. Evelyn S., I said, the one who wrote the will you didn't know existed. The air went still. Nadia's hand flew to her mouth. Mom had a will. She had foresight, I replied. Ryan recovered quickly, anger replacing confusion. This is insane, he said. You're living under my roof and threatening me with legal nonsense. That's when I felt the last thread of patience snap, not into rage, but resolve. You're living under a roof built by my hands, I said, voice steady, and you've mistaken my silence for weakness. He opened his mouth to argue, but Nadia spoke first, voice trembling but firm. Ryan, stop, she turned to me. Dad, what does this mean? I took her hands, felt how cold they were. It means your mother made sure I wouldn't be treated like scrap, I said, and it means the workshop isn't going anywhere until a lawyer says so. Ryan scoffed again, but there was fear behind it now. Fine, he said, call your lawyer, we'll see how far this goes. I nodded. We will. That afternoon, while Ryan paced and muttered into his phone, I made the call, my voice surprisingly calm as I explained the situation, and the lawyer's response was immediate and clipped. Do not discard anything. I'll schedule a reading. When I hung up, I felt something lift inside me, not triumph, not vengeance, but the quiet relief of a man who finally stopped apologizing for existing. That evening, Ryan didn't speak to me at dinner. Nadia barely touched her food. The kids sensed the tension and stayed quiet. I looked around the table at the home that was slowly turning into a battleground, and I understood that the will wasn't just about money. It was about boundaries, about drawing a line between respect and exploitation. When I went to bed, the envelope was gone from my pocket, replaced by something steadier in my chest. Evelyn had given me a gift, yes, but more than that, she had given me permission to stand my ground. And as I stared at the ceiling, listening to Ryan's restless footsteps down the hall, I knew the next time we all sat across from each other, it wouldn't be in this kitchen, it would be in a lawyer's office, where words like scrap lose their power and the truth finally has room to speak. The days between that phone call and the lawyer's scheduled meeting stretched longer than any winter I could remember, thick with tension and unspoken accusations. And inside the house, every movement felt measured, like we were all living on a fault line waiting for the ground to shift. Ryan avoided me entirely at first, slamming doors, making loud calls to people I assumed were friends or colleagues, always speaking in half sentences meant to sound confident, while Nadia drifted between us like a mediator who knew mediation wouldn't save what was breaking. Her eyes constantly flicking from her husband's clenched jaw to my calm, quiet resolve, and I hated that she was caught in the middle of something her mother had predicted but she never should have had to endure. The workshop remained untouched after the dumpster incident, the massive metal container sitting in the driveway like a threat, its open mouth waiting, and every time I passed it I felt a strange mix of anger and gratitude, anger that my life's work had been so casually condemned, gratitude that it hadn't yet been erased. Ryan finally confronted me 3 days before the meeting, cornering me in the hallway outside the study, his voice low and sharp, eyes burning with a mix of resentment and unease. You really went behind my back, he said. You called a lawyer to scare us. I looked at him steadily. I called a lawyer to protect what your wife's mother built, I replied. He scoffed. You think a few old contracts mean anything now? This isn't the 90s. Whatever you did back then is irrelevant. I nodded slowly. That's what you think because you've never built anything that lasted, I said, not cruelly, just truthfully, and the words landed harder than I expected because he flinched, a flicker of something like shame cutting through his anger. You're enjoying this, he snapped. You like watching me look stupid. No, I said, I like watching the truth come out. There's a difference. He stepped back, breathing hard, then turned away, muttering under his breath, and I realized then that Ryan wasn't just afraid of losing control. He was afraid of being exposed as a man who had mistaken confidence for competence. That evening, Nadia came to my room, closing the door behind her, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Dad, she whispered, what if this tears everything apart? I studied her face, the same face that once looked up at me asking how to ride a bike, how to trust the world. Sweetheart, I said gently, things that can't survive honesty were already broken. She nodded, tears spilling over. He keeps saying you're trying to take things away from us, she said, that you're punishing him. I shook my head. I'm not taking anything from you, I said. Your mother made sure of that, but I won't let him take from me anymore. Nadia swallowed hard. I didn't know Mom had done all this, she said. She never told me. She wanted you to love freely, I replied, without measuring people by what they could gain from you. The night before the meeting, I barely slept again, but this time it wasn't grief or fear that kept me awake. It was memory, vivid and insistent, replaying moments I hadn't thought about in years. Evelyn negotiating licensing terms with a confidence that surprised seasoned executives. Evelyn insisting we document every design, every technique, because men like Ryan exist, she once joked, though there had been steel behind the humor. She had seen the world clearly, and she had loved me fiercely enough to protect my work when I no longer thought it mattered. Morning came gray and cold, and we drove to the law office in silence, Ryan gripping the steering wheel like it might bolt away, Nadia staring out the window, and me sitting quietly in the back, feeling strangely steady, like a man who had already survived the worst part. Law office was smaller than Ryan probably expected, no marble floors or dramatic fountains, but it was solid, orderly, and calm, the kind of place where words were chosen carefully and meant something. The lawyer, Mr. Adler, greeted me warmly, shaking my hand with respect, then nodded politely to Ryan and Nadia, his expression neutral but observant. We sat across from each other at a long table, folders neatly stacked, and Ryan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, trying to project ease. "Let's get this over with," he said. Mr. Adler raised an eyebrow slightly. "Very well," he said. "I'll begin by clarifying something important." He opened a folder and slid a document toward Ryan. "Mrs. Evelyn Hart established the Hart Workshop Trust 12 years ago." Ryan frowned. "So," Mr. Adler continued, unruffled. "The trust holds intellectual property rights, design patents, and licensing agreements connected to Mr. Hart's workshop and professional work." Ryan glanced at the page, then another, his brow furrowing. "These numbers, this can't be right." "They are," Mr. Adler said calmly. "The trust has generated consistent revenue for over 4 decades." Ryan's face reddened. "From old furniture designs," he scoffed weakly. Mr. Adler didn't flinch. "From restoration methodologies, custom joinery systems, and specialty fixtures used globally," he replied. "Your father-in-law's scrap, as you called it, underpins several modern practices." Nadia gasped softly. Ryan sat forward, flipping pages faster now, panic creeping in. "Why wasn't I told about this?" "Because you were never entitled to it," Mr. Adler replied coolly. Silence fell heavy. Ryan laughed nervously. "So what, this is all his?" "The trust names Mr. Hart as primary beneficiary," Mr. Adler said, then turned to Nadia. "And you as secondary beneficiary." Ryan's head snapped up. "What?" "You," Mr. Adler said, looking at him directly, "are not a beneficiary." Ryan shot to his feet. "That's ridiculous. I'm her husband." "Marriage does not override a trust," Mr. Adler said, "especially not one designed explicitly to protect assets from misuse." Ryan turned to Nadia, eyes wide. "You knew about this?" "No," she whispered, shaking her head, "but I know why she did it." Ryan's voice rose. "This is a setup. You planned this." He pointed at me. I met his gaze evenly. "Your words planned this," I said. "Your disrespect." Mr. Adler cleared his throat. "There's more," he said, opening another folder. "The workshop property is held under the trust as well. Any attempt to discard, sell, or damage assets would constitute a breach." Ryan sank back into his chair, face pale. "The dumpster," he whispered. "Exactly," Mr. Adler said. The room felt smaller, heavier, and Ryan looked suddenly young, small, stripped of his swagger. "You called it scrap," I said quietly, "but it fed families, paid bills, built futures." Nadia reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." I squeezed her fingers. Ryan stared at the table, jaw clenched, breathing uneven. "So what now?" he muttered. Mr. Adler folded his hands. "Now," he said, "we discuss boundaries." And in that moment, I knew this meeting wasn't the climax. It was the turning point, the place where truth stopped being theoretical and started demanding consequences. And as I looked at my son-in-law, no longer towering but exposed, I understood that the fortune my wife protected wasn't just financial. It was the power to finally be seen, and I was done letting anyone call that scrap. The air in the lawyer's office felt heavier after Mr. Adler spoke the word boundaries, as if that single term carried more weight than all the numbers Ryan had just seen on paper. And for a long moment, none of us moved, Ryan staring at the table like it might offer him a different outcome if he looked hard enough. Nadia still clutching my hand as though grounding herself in something solid, and me sitting quietly. Realizing that the confrontation I'd braced for all these years wasn't explosive at all, but slow, surgical, and devastating in its calm, Ryan finally broke the silence with a hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "So this is it," he said. "You turn me into the villain and walk away with everything." I turned toward him, studying his face, the lines of stress etched deeper than I remembered. "I didn't turn you into anything," I said evenly. "You introduced yourself." He scoffed, but there was no real fire behind it now. "You let me think none of this mattered," he snapped. "You acted like some harmless old man tinkering in a shed." "That was your assumption," I replied. "I never claimed to be harmless, I just didn't need to prove myself to you." Mr. Adler cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Hart," he said, addressing me, "we should discuss the immediate implications." Ryan's head snapped up again. "Implications?" Mr. Adler nodded. "Given the attempted disposal of trust assets, the trust allows for corrective action." Ryan stiffened. "What kind of action?" Mr. Adler's gaze was steady. "The workshop will be secured under the trust's authority. Access will be limited." Ryan shot to his feet again. "You can't lock me out of my own house," he shouted. "The workshop is not your house," Mr. Adler replied calmly. "It is a trust-held property." Nadia flinched at Ryan's raised voice. "Ryan, please," she whispered. He turned on her, eyes wild. "You're just going to let this happen? He's undermining me and my own family." Nadia stood then, her voice shaking but clear. "No," she said, "you undermined yourself when you tried to throw away my mother's legacy." Ryan stared at her like he'd never seen her before. "Your mother never said—" "My mother didn't have to say it," Nadia interrupted. "She showed it every time she stayed up late helping Dad label drawers." Every time she defended his work when people mocked it, she believed in him and I should have spoken up sooner. Ryan's face twisted, anger and fear colliding. So what? He said bitterly, turning back to me. You win, congratulations, you've got your precious tools and your money. What now? You kick me out. The question hung there, sharp and accusing, and I realized this was the moment Ryan expected revenge, the moment he thought I'd finally swing the hammer back. I didn't. I leaned forward slightly, meeting his eyes. This isn't about winning, I said quietly. It's about respect. He laughed again, but it cracked halfway through. Respect, he muttered. That's rich. No, I said. What's rich is thinking you can erase decades of work because you don't understand it. Mr. Adler spoke again. The trust does not require Mr. Hart to remove anyone from the residence, he said. However, it does establish autonomy. The workshop remains intact and all associated income remains under Mr. Hart's control. Ryan sank back into his chair, running a hand through his hair. So I'm just what, a guest now? Nadia inhaled sharply. Ryan, she said, you were never supposed to be in charge of everything. We were supposed to be partners. He looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time his confidence didn't return her gaze. I was trying to protect us, he said weakly, by humiliating my father. She shot back, tears spilling now. By calling his life's work scrap. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. Mr. Adler began gathering papers. I recommend we adjourn for today, he said. Emotions are high. I'll formalize the protections immediately. Ryan didn't argue. He stood slowly, shoulders slumped, and for a moment I almost felt pity, not because he deserved it, but because men like Ryan build their identity on dominance, and once that cracks, they don't know who they are. Outside, the cold air hit us like a slap. Ryan walked ahead without a word, Nadia trailing behind him uncertainly until she stopped and turned back to me. Dad, she whispered. I didn't know how bad it was until today. I squeezed her hand. Neither did I admitted. The drive home was silent. Ryan gripped the steering wheel too tightly, his jaw clenched, the radio off. When we pulled into the driveway, the dumpster was still there, an ugly reminder of how close we'd come to losing something irreplaceable. Ryan stared at it for a long moment, then looked away. Inside the house, he went straight to the bedroom and closed the door harder than necessary. Nadia hovered in the kitchen, wiping a counter that was already clean. What happens now? She asked softly. Now, I said, we breathe. That evening, Ryan didn't come to dinner. The kids asked where he was, and Nadia told them he had a headache. I ate quietly, my appetite small but steady, feeling something unfamiliar settle over me, not triumph, but relief. Later, as I sat in the workshop, now officially protected, I ran my fingers over the workbench Evelyn and I built together, the scratches and stains telling stories only I could read, and I realized how close I'd come to letting shame silence me. Ryan's words replayed in my head, scrap, useless, embarrassing, but they no longer cut. They sounded hollow, like insults shouted into a canyon that refused to echo. That night, Ryan finally emerged, standing awkwardly at the doorway of the workshop. I didn't know, he said, voice low. I really didn't. I looked up from the bench. Not knowing isn't the same as not caring, I replied. He swallowed. I crossed a line, I nodded. Several. He shifted his weight. What do you want from me? There it was, the question beneath all the anger. I considered him for a moment. I want you to stop seeing me as an obstacle, I said, and start seeing me as part of this family, or not at all. He nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. As he walked away, I understood that the power shift wasn't about money or documents. It was about reclaiming the right to exist without apology. The lawyer's words had changed the legal landscape, yes, but the real change was quieter and more profound. Ryan no longer controlled the narrative of who I was. And as I turned off the workshop lights, the space glowing softly in the dark, I felt Evelyn's presence, not as grief but as strength, steady and approving, because the man who once let himself be called scrap had finally stood up and demanded to be seen. The house felt different after that night, quieter in a way that wasn't tense but reflective, like a place that had finally exhaled after holding its breath for years. And in the days that followed the lawyer's meeting, I noticed how Ryan moved through the space with a caution he'd never shown before, no longer barking orders or filling silence with confidence, but walking softer, speaking less, as if he were learning the dimensions of a home he'd thought he owned outright and now realized he only shared. Nadia changed too, though in a different way. She stood taller, spoke more clearly, and when she looked at me there was something new in her eyes, not pity, not apology, but recognition, the kind that says I see you now fully, and I hated that it took conflict to give her that clarity, but I loved that she had it at all. The dumpster was hauled away 2 days later without ceremony, its empty metal shell clanging as it left the driveway, and when the sound faded it felt symbolic, like the threat it represented had finally been removed, leaving behind the workshop intact, alive, humming with quiet purpose. I spent more time there after that, not hiding, not retreating, but working, finishing a small cabinet I'd started months ago, sanding the edges carefully, letting the grain guide my hands the way it always had, and Ryan watched once from the doorway without commenting, his arms folded not in judgment this time but uncertainty. That's it, precise, he said finally, almost surprised. I glanced up. Wood remembers how it wants to be treated, I replied. He nodded slowly like a man filing away a lesson he didn't know he needed. One evening, Nadia joined me in the workshop, bringing 2 cups of tea the way her mother used to, setting one beside me without a word and sitting on the stool opposite, just watching for a while before speaking. Mom would have loved this, she said softly. Seeing you here, not shrinking anymore, I smiled faintly. Your mother never shrank, I said. She expanded me. Nadia swallowed, then met my eyes. I didn't protect you, she said, not when he said those things. I set my tools down and reached across the bench, taking her hand. You don't protect your parents by fighting their battles, I said gently. You protect them by learning who deserves access to your life. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. That night, Ryan surprised us both by sitting at the table and clearing his throat before speaking, his voice awkward, stripped of its usual polish. I owe you an apology, he said, looking at me directly. Not the kind where I explain myself, just an apology. I waited. I was wrong, he continued, hands clasped tightly. About your work, about you, about what matters. The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. I accepted that apology when you stopped calling it scrap, I said finally. He exhaled, relieved and humbled all at once. I don't expect anything, he added quickly. I just didn't want the kids growing up thinking disrespect is normal. That mattered more to me than he knew. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the house settled into something healthier, not perfect, but honest. Ryan no longer treated the workshop as clutter. He asked before entering, watched when I worked, and once even asked if I could teach him how to fix a loose cabinet hinge, his movements clumsy but sincere. I showed him not because I needed to prove anything, but because teaching is the final act of mastery, and I realized that holding knowledge too tightly can turn protection into isolation. The lawyer finalized everything quietly, the trust secure, the income flowing steadily into accounts that Evelyn had set up with the same care she applied to every part of our life. And one afternoon, Mr. Adler called to confirm something that made me sit down heavily in my chair. The trust valuation had increased significantly due to renewed licensing interest sparked by a recent restoration project that used my original designs. Your work is having a moment, he said dryly. I laughed, a deep, startled laugh that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, because the irony wasn't lost on me. The things Ryan wanted to throw away were now more valuable than ever. But the fortune wasn't what changed me most. What changed me was waking up without the weight of being tolerated instead of respected, of feeling like my presence needed justification. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I stopped explaining why my hands shook sometimes. I stopped letting age be a reason people dismissed me. One Sunday afternoon, the kids came into the workshop and asked if they could help, their small hands eager, curious, and I gave them scraps of wood, real scraps this time, and taught them how to sand safely, how to listen to the sound of the grain, how patience feels when it's done right. And Ryan watched from the porch, quiet, thoughtful, and when Nadia leaned against him, he didn't stiffen the way he used to, he leaned back. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Ryan stood beside me on the porch, the air cool, stars faint overhead. I spent a lot of my life thinking success meant replacing old things with new ones, he said. Turns out I was just afraid of being ordinary. I considered that. Ordinary isn't a failure, I said. It's a starting point. He nodded, absorbing it. When I finally sat alone in the workshop again, lights low, tools hanging where they belonged, I felt Evelyn's presence not as memory but as momentum, a steady push forward, and I whispered my thanks, not just for the fortune she protected, but for the wisdom she left behind, the lesson that dignity doesn't need permission and legacy doesn't need to shout. Ryan never called my work scrap again. He never mocked the tools. And one afternoon, when someone else joked about old-fashioned methods, he surprised me by saying, "Careful, those methods built more than you know." I didn't smile outwardly, but inside something settled into place. The man who once tried to erase my life's work had learned its value, and the old man he underestimated had reclaimed not just his fortune, but his voice, his place, and his peace.